princes and the Holy Roman Emperor and the connections with the Pope. It was basically a system of privilege for a lot of people. Now, you could work your way up in this system of privilege. You could be born into it, or you could buy your way into it if you had the funds to do that with. Luther loved the church. That's the first thing we have to remember. Martin Luther loved the church. He was brought up in the church. He loved the church festivals. He loved the saints' days. He thought they were very important. That's why they're still on our calendar. He loved the Mass. And that's why during and after the Reformation, the Lutheran service of worship doesn't look that much different or sound that much different from the Roman Catholic Mass. In places, what you hear in a Lutheran church, an Episcopal or Anglican church, and a Roman Catholic church is almost identical. The layout of the Kyrie, the lessons, the communion itself, it's all there. A lot of people who came after Luther, and even during his own time, felt that Luther hadn't gone far enough. So they did what Luther called, and we're familiar with that old phrase, they threw the baby out with the water. You know, they just got rid of the saints' days, they changed the service, they stripped it down, and they just felt that Luther didn't take enough of the Roman aspects out of what became known as the Protestant service. So therefore we have an abundance of denominations. And as we mentioned last week, there's no other country on earth that has as greater number of denominations and cults and sects as you find in the United States. And of course that in its way is tied to our history. It's hard to disassociate the history of the church and the history of the modern world, let's say especially from that of the Emperor Constantine down to now, because they are intertwined in many, many different ways. And we know that even though we live in a nation where there is separation of church and state, we know that when it comes to election time, that the church plays into politics and politics plays into the church in a great way, especially as what different candidates are asked. What do you believe about this? What do you think about that? Where is your stand on this? October 31st, 1517. Well, for most people, it's Halloween, right? Let's face it, it's Halloween. You can't get away from that. If you could read, it was kind of like the community bulletin board, and you wanted to make sure people saw things, you put it up on the cathedral doors because people would gather around there. And because the next day was All Saints' Day, one of the high festival days in the church year, Luther knew a lot of people would be coming to church, a lot of influential people, a lot of academics and other theologians, a lot of people who were connected to the government as it was at the time, who could read and could write. So Luther had been very disturbed by what he perceived as decades of centuries of abuse within the church. Luther did not intend to change the church. He wanted the church to reform. Luther wasn't the first. There were people who came before him. Probably the most famous of which was a priest in Bohemia, Jan Hus. His followers became known as Hussites, who later went underground in Bohemia, what used to be known as Czechoslovakia, now the Czech and Slovak republics. They went underground and they emerged several hundred years later in Germany on the estate of a guy known as Count Friedrich von Zinzendorf. Now that's important because growing out of that is what we call the modern day Moravian Church. Jan Hus is generally thought of as the founder of the Moravian Church, which goes underground. Hus lived basically 100 years before Luther. He called for a lot of the same reforms of the church that Luther called for. Hus was burned at the stake. Okay. So you could be excommunicated at best But if you were found guilty of heresy, of being a heretic, you were probably going to die in one of several pretty gruesome ways. That's the way it worked. So even by Luther's time, even though people were a bit more enlightened 100 years later, there was great fear that Luther's life was in jeopardy. October 31st, 1570, the eve of All Saints' Day, Luther posts those 95 points of disagreement. We call them the 95 Theses. Theses is just the plural of the word thesis. You know, I want people to discuss these things. I want people to have an academic and theological discussion and debate about these things in the church that need to be reformed. Remember,